My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, there's a new Gloucester trade at Cooper's Bell Inn on the way to York, which has riled up a near relative. What is his secret? The PCs are on the case, but they'd better go carefully, because something stinks in Stilton.
Our first segment is Basic Crawl.
Issue number 8 of the Undercroft zine, Something Stinks in Stilton, is a 30-page adventure into darkest Cambridgeshire for levels 1 to 3. It was written and illustrated by Ollie Palmer, with a cover by Anxious P. Layout, editing and design are by Daniel Sell. The content of the module begins with a content warning before we begin: animal cruelty. And that is not an idle threat. The module itself then starts with the following. In the 13th century, Stilton produced amazing cheese. Then the church came, and suddenly the cheese trade died out. Now it's 1730, and the village of Stilton has started producing great cheese again.
So the first part of the module, after that little intro bit, is called The Backstory, in which we learn that about 9 months ago, a gentleman named Cooper Thornhill, his business, the Bell Inn, was having a bit of trouble. Cooper's brother rolls into town and convinces him to take up dairy farming. Cooper thinks this is a good idea. He finds an old barn and some land. He buys it from the nearby church, and he begins clearing it for production. While doing so, he discovers a trap door in the barn that leads to a sort of underground temple area with a purple glowing arch. Cooper's daughter, Heather, an apparent magic enthusiast, sets about to tapping into the arch's power in order to use it to boost their nascent dairy business. The magic goes awry, and Heather is transformed into a cow-human hybrid. However, Cooper discovers that she produces a strange bluish milk in her new form, which, when you drink it raw, swells you up and permanently dulls your wits, as happened to Cooper's son and his wife. But when you mix this blue milk in as part of the cheese-making process, it makes cheeses with this sort of addictive, hallucinogenic quality. Long story short, too late, Cooper hides the monstrous secret of the cheese production and begins marketing his cheese. Turns it into a nice little business.
And the next part of the module is called What Now?, in which we are told of the various ways the party might get involved in this adventure. And this section also includes a rumour table. Next is a section called The Sister-in-Law, detailing one of the ways, the best way, I think, that the party might get involved here, which is that Cooper's nosy sister-in-law hires them to discover the secret to his fantastic cheese, which, vexingly to her, he refuses to share with his brother. Then comes a section called Bandits, with an exclamation mark, which is why I said it like that, in which the party encounters a group of bandits. And depending on how and whether the party deals with them, this can have an effect that knocks on into the rest of the module's happenings. Next comes Welcome to Stilton, where we learn about the Bell Inn and the important NPCs in the module. This section also details a rather ghoulish meal that the characters can take at the inn, which we will be discussing more later on. Next is a section called That Night, in which we are given a detailed breakdown of what happens in and around the Bell Inn and the dairy farm from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m., critical moments in the mystery. Significantly, the party can learn that Cooper is kidnapping guests of the inn, although he will leave the party alone because they outnumber him and are armed. Next comes The Cowshed, in which we are given some basics about the dairy operations, and next is The Office, where the party can glean some clues.
Then comes the mini dungeon crawl portion, the dreadful, disgusting basement. This section includes a map and 9 keyed locations, each more horrific and revolting than the last, culminating in an encounter with the magical arch and the wretched Daisy the Beast cow. The module next discusses how to handle certain decisions the party might have made before or after the dungeon crawl, such as going to the authorities. And it wraps up with a section detailing the magical effects of the milk and the cheese, the contents of a spell scroll the party can find, and a description of the cowbell magic item worn by Cooper's dullard son, James.
And we'll conclude this intro with a couple of historical notes. Cooper Thornhill, owner of the Bell Inn, is in real life credited with being the pioneer of blue Stilton cheese in the 1730s. He didn't make it himself, but he did discover it in Wymondham, which I believe in the adventure is where his brother lives, and just had it shipped to his inn to sell to travellers on the Great North Road. As a factual nitpick, although this is called an adventure into darkest Cambridgeshire, up until 1965, Stilton was actually in Huntingdonshire. So, I feel like that undermines the entire factual basis of this adventure, and I'm not sure if we should continue.
Let's talk about how we've used this in our games. I have only read it.
I ran this as the first session of my open table Unsuin game, mostly using World of Dungeons as its central mechanic.
Awesome. And you actually adapted it to Unsuin, right, in terms of the setting?
Yeah, I had to because, there's not that much dairy production in Unsuin, I think. So I made it sort of a part of a pseudo-Nepal and Tibet part of my setting. So there was yaks instead of cows. Although a lot of the time I forgot to say yak instead of cow, but nobody seemed to mind.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about the things we liked in this module. I'm going to start with, I liked everything about this module. I love it. It is so good. Something Stinks in Stilton is total catnip for me. It has a really fantastic horror movie vibe, which if you've listened to the show, is my thing. It's got, splashes of black humor mixed in with some truly, truly horrifying moments. Like that basement sequence is fucking grotesque. It is horrifying. I just love it. It has this really terrific buildup. At first they kind of you get this kind of comic scene with the sister-in-law and the brother, talking about the cheese making. And I've got something to say about that during companion adventures. And then you've got, they get to the end. It all seems kind of very normal, but then we get this scene where they're eating some questionable food at the inn, and this build up, this is very classic horror movie stuff, right? We then go to people creeping about in the night, getting up to some kind of strange dark business, and the PCs can kind of get involved in that or see what's going on there, and then it kind of builds up to this sort of madness and terror at the end. It is so good. It really packs a punch.
Yeah, so it's pretty short, but it really is well staged. It's got what I love about that opening bandit encounter is that it actually serves a purpose rather than just being the let's warm up with some light calisthenics and bandit slaughter, because whether or not you defeat or arrest or whatever the bandits affects what happens to one of the NPCs later on. And during that nighttime segment, it has a whole bunch of things. Normally when you get an adventure like this, there'll be a little timeline of things going on in the night, and often almost no way for slumbering PCs to learn about it. Whereas this just has a series of escalating events that the PCs are very free to ignore if they want, but each one of them slightly more demands attention and involves more screaming and, running hither and yon and getting into scuffles and so on, which is a great way to gradually and, not exactly strong-arm them into investigating the cowshed, but that's kind of where you want it to go.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I really liked about the module are the sort of historical, real-world kind of notes and things in the module. You've already mentioned the the controversial placement in geography of the module and the story of the real life Cooper Thornhill. But I kind of love this because you can imagine the author Ollie eating a piece of Stilton blue and thinking, what if the blue vein in the cheese was something magical, right? And then just setting about to writing this module, right? I think that's super, super fun. I mean, I don't know if that's how he did it, but you could imagine it, right? And also during this sort of gruesome dining scene at the inn, we learned that they actually cure the cheese with maggots, right? They have maggots crawling around in it, and you can actually eat the maggots and things like that. That's a real thing. Did you know that? That sort of maggot cheese?
There's one in Sicily is quite famous.
Sicily,
they give you a little cloth to stop the maggots from jumping into your face. While you
exactly, right, lovely. Yeah. So I just kind of love those little historical touches, real world touches were fun.
Yeah, and actually that eating in the inn sequence is well done, because actually, just to talk about the format quite quickly, it's single column text and a fairly so a straightforward layout with some keywords in different entries highlighted by being in red. And the number of NPCs, if it was any more than it actually has, I think that format would not work. It would be too much to read and digest. But as it is, there are not that many. I think I'm going to say half a dozen, maybe 7 or 8 NPCs total to deal with.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So it's just enough that you can read it in this format and keep it in your head as the GM. But also, and this is what I think is pitched very well, it's enough to make the the pub feel crowded, even though it isn't really. If there were 6 people in a Wayside Inn, that's not a lot. But it's like enough for the players to lose track of where everybody is. If you're going over to talk to the owner's son, you've lost concentration on what someone else is doing, like where someone else has gone. So it feels like it's busy. And like if you were at a house party and that many people were there, you wouldn't be able to keep track of everyone's position in a room where like if there was 4 other people, you'd always know where everyone was. And so that adds to the uncertainty which you need in the horror film thing. Like everyone's alibi is a bit sketchy if they need to account for their whereabouts. So yeah, very well picked and quite nicely drawn characters as well. They've all just got a slightly different key note from each other that makes it easy to play them.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I had that same feeling when I was reading it, just this sense of like activity and the feeling of like a lot going on, but in a fairly small space, right? Like in a fairly small number of people. It was all structured very, very well. I love the nods to classic dungeoneering in the module. I don't know if you picked up on this, and I don't know if this was intentional, but I definitely picked up on this. So once you get to the basement portion, you start in this space that has all of these kind of happy cow motifs, right? We have like statues and frescoes of like pastoral scenes of cows, like looking so, resplendent and all this kind of thing. And that is so reminiscent of like how a lot of bigger temple dungeon crawls go, right? Like usually you get to that first chamber and it's like this kind of public facing, like happy, recall the frog temple.
Yeah,
or
like
fame, right?
Sailors on the Starless Sea has that when you go down below the castle as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought that was great. Some other nods to classic dungeoneering. There are cow rats. And, in classic dungeon crawls, rats are one of the first things you fight. I like that these are sort of cow rat hybrids. We have beastmen, a classic, you're a Warhammer fan, sort of trope, except these are like cows. They're cow beastmen. We have a magical gate at the end with a great big monster. Like it has all of these like nods and beats of like a very large dungeon crawl, but it's like really bite-sized, right? It's a tiny little dungeon.
Yeah, it's a cellar.
Yeah, it's exactly. It packs a huge amount of flavor in a small bite, kind of like a piece of blue cheese.
Yeah, very good.
So yeah, other things I like, the backstory is really great, very fun to read, it kind of gets you in the mood. And I've already said it before, but Jesus Christ, the basement portion is so good. It's just grindhouse level horror shit, and I'm so into it. I don't want to like say a lot of what it is because for one thing, it's kind of gross and like big content warning type stuff, but man, it's good.
Yeah, I can only agree. I mean, my notes here literally say all the other stuff you said, so correct.
Thank you. Good. I'm glad I got it right. Let's go to questions we had. I do have a few. So how long did this take you to run?
Not very long at all, actually. It was maybe 3 hours, I think, was our session length. And that was including character generation for 3 World of Dungeons PCs, which is not long, but it's also not short. So yeah, it's definitely a one-shot, I think. Maybe it could be 2 if you're a very leisurely kind of group. But
yeah, I pegged it at about, for me personally, it would probably be 2 because I would spend a session on the build up, right? Like traveling to Stilton and, the encounters and things like that. I'd probably pepper in a few other things just to kind of misdirect a little bit. But I think the actual, like once you get to the inn, that's probably like 1 session, I'm guessing, just based off my past experience.
So. Yeah.
Second question, where did Daisy the Cow Beast come from? I feel like I'm missing something there. I don't remember the introduction of this creature and suddenly it's there. Because Heather is the
human turned into a cow.
One of the human cow hybrids, but like Daisy the Cow Beast, which is the monster at the end, I kind of missed that. Like, was Daisy always there? Or I kind of missed like how that came up.
Yeah, I don't know if it's actually specifically given. I assumed at the time and never thought to check that it's like one of the normal cows that has maybe been fed some of the blue milk and gone weird. But yeah, good question. Who knows? Yeah,
I'm not sure. It felt kind of, I mean, it's cool, but I was like, oh, where did Daisy the Cow Beast come from? Other question I had is, in keyed location number 4, we are told that the party gets a, quote, sudden mooing in the face. Question, did you do this? Follow-up question, will you do this?
No, I did not do this because nobody was curious enough to look inside those pens as it describes there. They were quite focused on not looking at anything terrifying, and by that time they were pretty convinced everything down there was going to be terrifying. So no, I didn't didn't have the opportunity to practice my sudden mooing. And also, actually, as you'll recall, these were yaks, and I can't do a yak noise.
Fair
or at least
enough.
I don't think I can, because I'm not really sure what it would be.
Yaks.
Yeah.
Awesome. Did you have any questions?
Yeah, although I have to kind of ask it in a slightly abstruse way in order to fit this do you have questions format, which is, while reading, did you, Jason, spot the kind of unspoken GM prompts that are in the text? Now, I suspect that you did.
I did.
Because I think that spotting these things is like a having played role-playing games kind of thing. But if you chose Something Stinks in Stilton to be your first ever adventure to run as a GM, which, by the way, A+, good choice, I think you might miss out on some important things that are strongly hinted at. For example, there is the NPC called Samantha Drake, who may or may not get robbed, depending on whether the PCs deal with the bandits in the opening sequence. And so the subtext there is that the GM should give every reasonable chance for the PCs to find out that she's arrived, and that those bandits they didn't fight earlier are the ones that kind of caused her to be penniless now, which then has a knock-on effect if that happened, which is that she's going to get kidnapped and turned into a cow monster or something. So I think there are a few hints that maybe you need to look out for when you read this text. Is that?
I think that's right. Yeah, I picked up on that. I mean, I got the impression that maybe it was a word count constraint, possibly, that made it so the author didn't like put big flashing signs on the important GM bits, right? I picked up on a lot of that stuff though. Like another thing is the strange meat that the characters can eat in the inn. I mean, that is clearly like meant to be like a sort of like quasi cannibalistic moment, right? Because they're eating some of the like butchered cow people or whatever.
That's right, yeah.
But like that's not super called out in the text, right? And it's actually a really, really critical moment in the mystery, and also a very critical moment for selling the flavor of the module, right? But it's kind of just like implied or hinted at, right? It's really on the GM to kind of pick it up and kind of do something with it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it occurs to me now that in a way that might also be helping the novice GM, because I remember when I was first GMing, I was quite bad at, playing it cool with the important information. So if someone had said, hey, is this like weird cannibal meat? I would have probably gone, yeah, no, whereas in this case, I think it would be good if maybe keep the text as it is, but highlight that in red, because I don't think it is in. So it's important and you have to say it, but if the players call you on it, you go, it doesn't say in the scenario. It doesn't say whether it's cannibal meat. So,
and to the module's credit, a lot of the important bits are highlighted in red, which is nice.
Yeah, there's only one or two bits where I thought, that should be in red, but like it's a matter of opinion, I would say.
Let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom, kick us off.
Yeah, I like the page of eventualities called Help, the PCs decided to ... And it just has a list of things they might try and do, like report it to the local sheriff or constable or whatever he's called. And in these emergencies, this is what the GM should do. And it applies to some of the courses of action that the NPCs might take as well. Very handy.
I love this gruesome bit of text right in the beginning and the backstory. Really, really sets the table, so to speak. And it goes, as the family tried to scramble out of its path, they lost track of their surroundings and Heather fell through the portal. There was another sickening, tearing sound, but this time a different kind of beast lay, stunned, behind the arch. It was a cow, in that it was on all fours and had udders, but its face resembled a contorted version of Heather. Her face had been stretched grotesquely over the skull of a cow, her mouth hanging to one side while her nose lay smeared across a cow's snout. It goes on for some time, but it's a good one.
Yeah, and I think I've just realised that previous cow is Daisy, the cow beast that we were discussing earlier.
Is it? Okay, yeah. It's confusing. Yeah.
Anyway, my second one is also just another quote. This is from the mini dungeon crawl section in one room. Under there is a body. If the players weren't told about William or what he looks like, then this will be meaningless to them.
Nice. I like one of the rumors, which is they say that if you tell a lie in the presence of a Stilton cow, it will moo at you. This is false, but I just love the rumor because I can imagine the fun scenes that come from that.
And in play, my last one, we found the initial part of sneaking into the cowshed pleasantly informative on the subject of how to make cheese on an industrial scale. It's nice.
Nice. And I'm going to finish up with the creepy as fuck moment when you can find James Thornhill, the sort of like magically dim-witted son of Cooper. You can find him in the inn drawing stick figures in the window fog of people, but then he changes the stick figure humans into cow shapes. And this is a hint about that you'll learn about later, that he's kind of obsessed with like what happened to his sister turning into a cow creature, right? I just love this little detail. It's so creepy, so good. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. We are talking about food. Food is the topic for the Expert Delve. You know, the premise of this conversation, Tom, I think, is that eating is such a sensory experience, right? There are a lot of powerful associations and even emotions surrounding food. And I think that food scenes in games are a really, really terrific opportunity to reinforce theme and to add a lot of like texture and depth and richness. And importantly, one of the things I want to cover during this conversation is how do we make sure not to waste a good food scene? Like, getting the most out of a food scene, I think, is really important, because this module has a really, really good eating scene, right? So I think that's what I'd like to talk about. I'd also like to talk about, as a sort of offshoot of the conversation, games and game products that incorporate food into their rule sets and how you can kind of crib some of those ideas. So what do you think so far?
Yeah, I think that's a promising topic. I'm not a huge, well, actually, we'll get into that later. Like, I'm not like hugely into banquet scenes and stuff as a rule, but I do think it's great to have some awareness of food and drink as they crop up and become, like kind of props or set dressing. For me, I like to put a little bit of thought into that so that I have things I can refer to ready to go if it becomes somehow important, which it often does at surprising times.
Yeah, well, so, okay, I have a whole list, extensive notes here on like how to make food scenes really pop. Before I go into my list, is there anything you want to kind of throw out there, like just your ideas about it?
I'll give you a mini anecdote with a bit of player advice before we go to your thing for GMs, which is don't tune out when the GM starts describing food, okay? When I was back in university, I was in this very good Warhammer Fantasy role-playing campaign where the GM had clearly done a lot of kind of historical research about what people ate in Renaissance-era Germany. And so breakfast was often quite detailed. And I would sort of sit there and think about something else, like, how am I going to usurp the actual older brother's position in this duchy to take over the manor house, that kind of thing. But I shouldn't have done that, because, in fact, this was really interesting. And maybe it would get a little bit overlong, but I could have done Garrett, the GM, given him the respect of just listening a little bit more. So, because now I think back and I think I have missed out. I missed out on some actually pretty good game content because I'd already decided, this isn't good.
Don't be a crap player like Tom used to be. It's Tom's first point of advice. Okay, well, that's a pretty good bit of player advice. I think that much of the work here kind of falls on the GM. I mean, this is you've kind of alluded to it with your Garrett anecdote, that this is the kind of thing that like the GM, it's an opportunity for the GM to kind of really get into it, right? And to really do something special for the players, and hopefully your players appreciate it and pay attention. So let's talk about GM things. Any just opening thoughts on like GM things to do? Well,
I would kind of do the opposite of the player advice, which is throw things at the players to make them pay attention. So give them, for example, a quick intro of what's on the table, ask them what they order. That's always good. And they may go, oh God, I don't know, what is there? But that's fine. That's just your opening to start telling them about the many cheeses available in this part of the empire.
Awesome. Well, so I wanted to start by saying that my advice here about like how to make food scenes really pop, this is basically just going to be like a greatest hits of all my other Expert Delve advice from the show. But the context here of eating and food, that sort of sensory experience is actually really, really important. And I think that some of my like tried and true GM techniques really shine here. So obviously be descriptive. The rule of three, which is Jared Sorensen's RPG advice, which I've kind of like adapted. Use 3 sensory descriptions for the dish that's being eaten. What does it look like? What does it taste like? How does it feel? How does it look like it feels? That kind of thing. How does it smell? I think that's a pretty basic thing you can do. I think that you can use my paint the scene technique to invoke theme, right? So basically, I think of a theme or a motif or an idea that I want to explore in the scene, and I pose a question to the players wherein their answers will help develop the idea, right? So you can imagine a few here in the context of a great food scene, such as, how does this meal remind you of home, right? If they've been away from home for a while, if they're on a long journey and they have this meal that suddenly reminds them of home, it's a great opportunity for the players to talk about their characters' experiences, what they miss from home, that kind of thing, and maybe even talk about their backstory a little bit. And they're doing it in the context of this meal that the characters are eating. Another question might be, tell me a favorite memory associated with the last time you ate this, right? Another question, how does the food you are being served tell you that this prince or noble or whoever is very wealthy? That's a great one, because the classic sort of like fantasy banquet scene, Tom, you said earlier, like, you don't like to do those kinds of scenes. And I get it. Like, it's not like adventure, right? It's a bit of a cliche, but I think you can take that sort of classic banquet scene in front of the king or whatever, and you can pose a question like that, like, tell me something about the banquet that indicates like the wealth and largesse of this person, right? Have the players like kind of fill in those details, and suddenly they're involved in the descriptive part. They're involved in building up the scene, and they have more buy-in and they're more attached to it. Yeah,
that's right. That's why, I mean, you could do the splendiferous banquet by describing in great detail how they've got like an ox containing a pig, containing a sheep, and so on, or whatever. But you can cut to the chase and do the old painting the scene technique, and that's a much more fun way to get to it, I think. And you should sometimes skip a meal scene if it's not telling you anything. So if it's not telling you why the prince is wealthy, or it's not going to be a scene where the characters are going to reveal something about themselves through the choices they make or what they say to each other at the meal, then maybe don't. But equally, it can often be just a good, memorable backdrop to a group chat scene. So, I mean, it's not great. It's a bit vague, a bit of a vague opinion, but only do as much as feels like is necessary at the time, I would say.
I think you've hit on something there by saying, like, how is this relevant to the story that we're telling, right? Like, if there's a connection, if it's relevant, then I think there's an opportunity to make that scene a really cool scene, right? I mean, I'm also sometimes occasionally into the sort of like indulgent kind of description heavy, like kind of scene, right? That maybe has no connection to anything. That's fun. We're there to sit down and enjoy each other's company, right? Ultimately in a game. And so I think there's space for that. But I do think there's something to be said about, okay, how is this connected to the story? And that's when you really can kind of lean into it. Something Stinks in Stilton has this, right? So, the module, and I'm just like reading this straight from the module, we're told that the characters can get these steaks, right, served to them at the end. This is in that sort of like what I think is a very like tonally and thematically important scene in the module where they're eating at the end. We're told that these steaks are also on offer, but while they seem to look delicious, they're smothered in Stilton cheese sauce. If a player tries some without the sauce, they'll find they taste a bit off, as if they've been cooked alongside something or marinated in an unusual way. I read that part of the module and I immediately thought, oh man, how can I use one of my GM techniques, such as paint the scene, to really, really go deep on this, to like really enhance this for the players, right? So it's honestly like, it's moments like this in the module I think are a terrific opportunity to kind of fuck with the party a little bit, right? So they may already at this point in Something Stinks in Stilton, they may already be leery of the cheese, right? In which case they might choose to have the steak without the cheese sauce. If they do, tell them something is off about the meat and then ask them the following paint the scene question. The steak looks delicious and well cooked, but when you bite into it, something tastes off. How do you know something strange is going on with this meat? And I imagine the players like all automatically starting to run through their heads like, what did my character just put in their mouth, right? Like, what is going on here? And then I think, and I've had scenes like this in games. This is a very, very fun process, a very, very fun way of getting the players involved in this thematic detail of the module. Some other bits of advice: have names of dishes ready to go. If you're the GM, don't just gloss over this part. Similar to our advice about having your nautical terms ready to go for seafaring adventures, having a menu kind of ready to go, just a short one, really, really can dramatically deepen the immersion of the scene, I think. What do you think about that, Tom?
Oh, yeah, I think that's actually can be player-facing advice as well, because if you're mostly eating within the same culture, like if you're traveling from country to country, obviously it's a bit more difficult for the players to prep what they would be eating. But a few listeners may be aware that some time ago I designed a game that was set in 19th century Rio de Janeiro. And one thing that kept coming up in playtesting was we would be having a scene and someone would say, okay, we go sit down in the cafe and I order and they'd go, what would be a beer they'd have now? And I would go, I don't know. And then we'd sort of kind of talk around the subject and like snacks. What would you have for a snack? What would you have for a main meal? And so eventually that game now has a 2-page just list of not very detailed. It doesn't kind of bang on about what ingredients are in things. It just tells you this is a snack made of this kind of meat, or this is some wine you might order. And then you can just quickly look at that. It's a little shared resource everyone has and go, oh yeah, I order 2 bottles of this, and then we sit down and we talk for a while. And it immediately makes it seem much more believable, and you don't have that little awkward pause where you kind of just try and dredge something out of your imagination. Obviously, that's less important in a fantasy game where you can literally make up something on the spur of the moment. But even then, you might want to have a little baseline of what kind of stuff does everyone eat. And if everyone's sharing those common ingredients and staples, then it will feel like they all live in the same place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are different aspects of fantasy games that are easy to gloss over or ignore, that if you pay attention to them, they actually go a long way toward making the fantasy setting seem, quote, realistic, right? Or coherent, I think is the better word. I have a thing about names, right? Like names of characters. I demand and insist that like names of people from a similar geographical location sound kind of similar, right? And I spend a fair amount of time making sure that's the case. And it's because it increases that level of world coherency, right? It makes it seem just that little bit more believable. And I think the food is another one of those angles, right? If you have a menu, or you have some dishes that feel very they match, right? They match based off the region, based off the things you've described so far. And if they feel sort of culturally coherent and they go with one another, I think that goes a long way toward increasing that believability. It's something worth trying. I think your point about, how you had to put the menu notes into Melandros, I think is a really, really great segue into the next thing I want to talk about, which is games and other game books that incorporate food. I think that at the end of the day, tabletop role-playing games, we are a group of people who are sitting down to enjoy each other's company and have a good time, right? And take away the game bits, and you're left with conversation, you're left with laughter and chit-chat and talking. You're left with essentially what might happen in a good meal, right? Except we just inject game stuff into the middle of all of it, right? And so I think it's worth taking a look at games that consider community, consider sharing, consider being at the table together, consider food, right? So the first one that pops to mind for me is 1001 Nights by Meg Baker. It is, I guess, a classic story game, we'll say, about these sort of nested Arabian Nights style stories that you're all telling together. You play characters who are involved in one story, but then one of those characters begins to tell a story to the other characters, and then you dive into that deeper story, right? And you can have up to 3 levels of inception, so to speak, of stories being told by various characters, right? But in the middle of all this, you are advised, and indeed it might be part of the rule set, that you should have food on the table that is food that you might find in a Mediterranean or Middle Eastern setting, right? So olives, cheeses, that sort of thing, right? And I've played 1001 Nights doing that with, having my food spread, and it really, really enhances the game in a huge way, because the game's it's about storytelling at various levels, both meta and levels within the fiction itself, right? And so having people sitting around a table sharing food, telling stories of people telling stories of people telling stories is quite good and really, really amplifies the experience. And I have to say, this is really, really gold star GMing or whatever, but if you know you have a good food scene coming up, having appropriate nibbles at the table, that's a pretty gold star move, in my opinion. Not saying you should do it every time, but boy, what a great opportunity.
Yeah, that's good, actually, because it's making you do a mini LARP while you're talking, because the kind of hand movements you would make while holding, I don't know, a cube of cheese are going to be different from if you're munching on a burger. And you've just reminded me of one of my favourite trad role-playing memories from many years ago, which was where we were playing Call of Cthulhu. I assume Masks of Nyarlathotep, because it always seemed to be. And I found myself, we were having, the sort of conference scene where we're discussing the leads in someone's study or like drawing room. And I found myself expressing some theories about the clues while making myself a gin and tonic at a sideboard. And I turned around with a glass in my hand and thought, this is amazing.
Nice.
So that was good, yeah.
Yeah, oh, you've just reminded me of another game that I didn't have in my notes, but Baron Munchausen, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, right? Where you are meant to... It's another story game where you are telling Baron Munchausen style tall tales to each other, trying to get everybody to laugh. And you are supposed to play it at a pub and be drinking, and like the stakes of the story you're telling, if people like it or don't like it, is you do or do not have to buy the next round of drinks, right?
Yes, I have done that. It's quite challenging, I have to say.
Yeah. That game is not the easiest game in the world, if I'm being honest, but it's another game that incorporates food. Charang Biswas released a game about a year or two ago called Feast. And in this game, everyone brings a small dish, each dish representing one of the taste sensations, sour, bitter, sweet, and so forth. And then you play this game, this story of a creature, some kind of demon or an alien that is eating the memories of a person. And so as you eat these little dishes as players, you let the flavor of the food inspire your narration about the memories of this person that the demon or the alien is consuming, right? I mean, that is a very, very interesting setup for a game, but you can imagine it being a modular part of a bigger fantasy game, right? Like maybe you are a mind flayer eating the memories of some victim or something like that, right? I mean, or a demon or whatnot. I think there are a lot of lessons that more trad focused gamers can take from story games, because hippie story gamers like to do cute twee shit, but sometimes that cute twee shit like turns into like really, really good gameplay experiences. And I think that some of these food games are a great example of those.
Yeah, that's reminded me of another thing not on the list, which is Graham Wormsley wrote a LARP about a family gathering where everyone has to, I think it's called marinara. It's named after, I'm pretty sure it's marinara. Mm-hmm. And everyone has to bring an ingredient for the sauce and you all make it together, right. And then while you play the game. That's a pretty good one. Again, quite difficult to incorporate into Dungeons and Dragons probably, but you never know. Worth thinking about. It might not be, actually. Yeah.
It may not be as hard as you think. You have to kind of plan around it, right? Like it may not be that tough. We hear these stories all the time of like, the A+ GM who goes like above and beyond for their players by doing X, Y, or Z, right? And if, something you can do as a GM to give the players a very special experience is to have a session that revolves around food like this, right? I mean, especially if it's like a critical part of the story, right? So, it's just something to think about. I mean, like I said, it's very, very gold star kind of GMing, but it is, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, although it is making me hungry, so I think we should move on to different aspects of food games.
Possibly. Another game book I want to point out or highlight, Blaze in the Dark, is a game that has a lot to say about the food of that setting, the city of Duskfall. It's very, very evocative, and it actually goes a really long way toward helping you understand the setting and understand the culture of the people of Duskfall. I'll throw in a note from Melandros. You've already said it, but I'll throw a note there.
Thank you.
I got some Twitter and Slack recommendations from people. These are things either I don't remember or I have not looked into yet, but I do want to just kind of call out a few that look pretty interesting. Morgan Ellis reminded me of the fabulous way Dark Sun treated food in its text. And he reminded me of a few things that I hadn't thought about for a long time. And one of them was that in the gladiatorial arenas of Dark Sun, your characters could purchase these fat slugs that had just enough water to refresh you for the length of the fight, right? That's pretty great. I was reminded that The Dark Eye, a German fantasy game, big German fantasy game that has a long and storied world and well-developed meta thing. But The Dark Eye has a lot to say about its world's food. It actually has like things you can purchase, like cards that have like drinks that you can get at the bars and things like that. So that's a pretty cool thing. Though I'm told that the Wormskin zine, issue number 2, has a tavern fare generator. David Morrison reminds me of another Graham Walmsley game, Tavern. I have not looked at that one yet, but I've heard of it. And it's about running a tavern and has a lot of food things in it. Jim Crocker recommended Delicious in Dungeons, which is like a manga about eating monsters.
Yeah, people keep recommending that to me. I must get around to it at some point.
I need to get around to it, yeah. Our friend Ramanan S. recommends The Inn at the Crossroads, a blog about the food of A Song of Ice and Fire. All of this is to say that there are a lot of really great resources out there for bringing evocative food things to your game, listener. Tom, is there anything else you want to say about food?
No, but I really want to wrap up the podcast now. I've got to go and get a snack.
Indeed. Well, let's do it. Let's go to Companion Adventures. Hi, listeners. I want to tell you about the newest issue of Codex Emerald. At 60 pages, Codex Emerald is the biggest issue of Codex yet. It also happens to be the best. Here's what you'll find inside. Emerald City Drama Club, a surreal and dreamy framework for Monster Hearts 2, about a group of kids putting on a production of The Wizard of Oz. Dark Designs in Verdigris, a game about exploring the Emerald City's seedy underbelly, a neighborhood called Verdigris, with mechanics inspired by World of Dungeons and traditional fantasy games. Duelhoven, a deluxe scenario for Dungeon World that explores a labyrinth of dwarven tunnels, stairs, homes, workshops, and crypts. It features a lot of really fantastic forward-looking tech for Dungeon World. Our miscellany, 3 dozen jeweled treasures, allegedly blessed or cursed, 9 original illustrations, and custom layouts by Jake Householder and Jesse Ross. To get Codex Emerald, just make a $5 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by February 1st. That's at patreon.com/gauntlet. Thanks. So it's the Companion Adventures. I thought we'd start with film. I'd like to recommend the 1980 film Motel Hell, which has the very, very cool VHS tape illustration, as I recall. It's actually Motel Hello, but the O is burned out. So it's Motel Hell, yeah. And Motel Hell is honestly something stinks in Stilton in a lot of ways. It's the people who run this hotel also serve this particularly delicious, like, I think it's sausage or something. And what they're doing is they're kidnapping folks and using them to produce food. So it's pretty great tonally and subject matter wise. It's pretty close to Stilton. Obviously, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I think, is a pretty great touchstone here, both in terms of visuals and in terms of feeling and tone. This is the original, mind you. I've never seen the newer ones.
Oh, yeah, my film recommendation is Delicatessen, and from the sounds of it, Motel Hell has a very similar plotline. It stars Dominique Pignon as this guy who moves into a block of flats in a post-apocalyptic city, and kind of below him, I think, in the building, is a guy running is it a butcher shop or a restaurant? I've forgotten now. Anyway, you can guess what's in the sausages. And the main character falls in love with the butcher's daughter. And so it's like Motel Hell, but more kind of whimsical and French. That's directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet and Marc Caro, who kind of went on to bigger and, in some cases, better. And in the case of Alien Resurrection, not as good things.
I have a TV recommendation, an interesting TV recommendation. I was wondering if you're going to ask me about it in the notes, Tom. I'm going to recommend the classic British sitcom Keeping Up Appearances. Do you know Keeping Up Appearances, Tom?
I do know Keeping Up Appearances, yes.
So Keeping Up Appearances is, well, so it's a show about this sort of middle-class woman and her husband and all of her like kind of extended family. Their last name is spelled Bucket, but she insists it be pronounced Bouquet. And they're all named after flowers. Anyway, the point is, Hyacinth, the main character, she has this like she's very nosy and she's very like social climby, right? She's always wants to put on this like, she's like more sophisticated and she's more upper class than she really is, right? And she's embarrassed of her lower class sisters, right? And so anyway, I love this though because the sister-in-law and the brother, I immediately thought of Hyacinth and her husband when I was reading Something Stinks in Stilton. And I thought, oh man, if you needed like a comedy reference for how that scene should go, watch just a single episode of Keeping Up with Appearances, and you've got the sister-in-law and brother scene down pat.
Yeah, that's actually a very good match, because, of course, the husband, Francis, in the scenario, doesn't care about the secret and so on, and that annoys her, and that's exactly what it's like.
Yeah, it's just like Keeping Up Appearances is so that, like, on the money. So let's talk about other things. Tom, what do you got?
I've got an episode of a podcast. The podcast is Drunk Women Solving Crime, and the episode I recommend is the one entitled Lavinia Fisher, America's First Female Serial Killer. If you're looking on their list of episodes, it's the one with the comedian Lucy Porter as the guest. And, much like Delicatessen, this has a pretty similar vibe. I don't think they kind of ate anybody, but it is a historical crime in which travelling men who were not going to be missed got murdered by this husband and wife, and I think some other people, team of murderers. Like all the best podcasts, Drunk Women Solving Crime has a 3-part format. So if you want to get straight to the case proper, skip to about 12 minutes in that episode.
Awesome. I have a podcast recommendation also. Our Dungeon World actual play podcast, We Hunt the Keepers, just finished a series called The Merry Abattoir. And there are a few episodes in that series, right around episode 5, 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there, where the characters are staying at this inn and tavern called the Corpse Delicatessen. It's whatever the German is for Corpse Delicatessen. That's the name of it. And I love these scenes because I was I'm the GM in that. I was really leaning into these kind of like gross descriptive food scenes, like the stuff they're eating at Corpse Delicatessen. And one of the things, for example, is they drink there's this alcohol, this spirit that is made from the sort of embalming fluids of casketed bodies that are right there in the middle of the dining chamber. And there's lots of like nice descriptive bits about what that tastes like and what it looks like and that kind of thing. So if you want some good gruesome food stuff, the whole Merry Abattoir series is pretty great. And listeners, that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. The Gauntlet can be found at Gauntlet RPG on Twitter. We have a website at gauntlet-rpg.com, and we're on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Hey, we would love your support on Patreon, but maybe for whatever reason you can't do that right now. Another great way of supporting the show is to go to iTunes and rate and review Fear of a Black Dragon. We will take that in lieu of your $2. Tom, thanks so much.
Jason, thank you. And thanks to Paul, as ever, for his editing skills being applied to this podcast and making us sound smart.
And thanks, listeners. Take care.